Everyone muted. And the meeting is being recorded by the host. Good, just so we can hear the presenter speak without any interruptions. Good. They can probably see us with the camera. Yeah. Sure.
I'm not going to be in here. Bill Clinton and Herbie Hancock.
Well, everyone, good morning. And good morning for those still joining us online. We're glad that you're all here for this conversation. Cliff Volpe, correct, will be leading our discussion, and we have a guest speaker with us as well. So give them all your love and care for today.
Hi, everyone. If I haven't had a chance to meet you, my name's Cliff, and our special guest today is Alina Zaitseva.
Could I just interrupt you real quick?
Yeah.
I'm gonna get somebody muted here. You're the host and I can't do it from back there. Let's see. So where participants? Sorry to interrupt, but
No, you know,
yeah, let's just. Okay. Yep, you're good now. Now you are not muted. Good. Let's get the participants out of the way. Oh, where is that now? There you go. All right,
great.
sorry.
No problem. Thank you. Okay, here we go. Introducing Alina Zaitseva. Alina is from Ukraine. She moved here last July as a refugee. She's from the war-torn city of Donetsk in the east. And I met Alina 8 years ago when I was living and working in Ukraine as an international monitoring officer supporting the peace process. So Alina and I are going to talk about the conflict in Ukraine today. We'll talk about what led up to the conflict, what's been happening during the conflict, what we think might happen in the future. I'm going to work off a PowerPoint presentation for a while. When I'm done, I'll hand it over to Alina, and she'll talk about her personal experiences, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. So I can hear a little echo, so I'm going to turn this down. So to understand what led up to the conflict now, we should look back at Ukraine in 2014. That was a very pivotal year for the country. There's 4 things that happened that were really significant. One is Maidan, the Revolution of Dignity. Another is Russia's annexation of Crimea. The war in Donbass, Donbass being the eastern region of Ukraine. And the downing of an international airliner, Malaysian Airlines flight MH17. I'll draw your attention to This figure on the left, Viktor Yanukovych, who was the president of Ukraine in 2014. Now, Ukrainians were tired of corruption in their country. And they had had an orange revolution in 2004 and trying to rid themselves of corruption. And Viktor Yanukovych had promised Ukrainians to sign a pivotal agreement with the European Union that would have allowed Ukraine to become more aligned with the West. And Ukrainians wanted this because they saw that being more aligned with the West meant that you'd rid yourselves of corruption, you'd prosper economically, and you'd flourish as a nation. At the last second, Yanukovych changed his mind, and instead of signing an agreement with the EU, he signed an agreement with Russia. Ukrainians were livid. They felt like they had been betrayed. So Ukrainians, tens of thousands of people took to the streets of capital city Kiev, down in the main square called Maidan, and they protested. And these protests started out peaceful, but over the weeks, they turned violent. And it culminated in government-controlled police opening fire on the crowds and killing over 100 people. Yanukovych lost control of his position as president, and he fled to where? To Russia. And this was the revolution of dignity, excuse me. Now, what happened next? Russia presumably was quite upset. They just lost their puppet president in Ukraine. And here's a map of Ukraine. Ukraine's a huge country, by the way. It's the second largest in Europe, behind Russia. And if you look at this map of Ukraine, there is what looks like an island down here. That is Crimea. It's actually a peninsula. A very significant place to Ukraine. There's naval ports there. There's a lot of tourism. It's very rich in resources. Literally within weeks of the revolution, Russia swept in with military units, unmarked military units, and they stole this area. They took control of Crimea. The West called it little green men because the soldiers who came in didn't have any insignia, no rank. So Russia could claim plausible deniability and say, oh, these aren't our soldiers, even though everyone knew it was Russian soldiers doing this. Here's one of the naval ports in Crimea that Russia had been leasing from Ukraine. Now, essentially, Russia had stolen it from Ukraine. And within a week, Russia held a referendum where they had the local population vote on whether or not they wanted to secede from Ukraine. And you can see in this cartoon, it's kind of a joke. It says referendum. You can either vote yes, Crimea is Russian, or no, Crimea is not Ukrainian. So basically the same thing. There's widespread international condemnation for the so-called referendum because it violated international law and it violated the principle of territorial integrity. Now, at the same time, Russia supplied weapons to the people living in Donbass. And they encouraged those people, many of those people were ethnic Russian, and they had an affinity for Russia. And they encouraged those people to rise up and to become independent, just like Crimea had become independent. So next thing you know, there's basically a civil war going on in the eastern part of Ukraine with the Ukrainian government trying to take back control of the east and these pro-Russian separatists trying to become independent. And the weapons that Russia supplied to the separatists it wasn't just rifles and handguns, it was tanks, missile systems, aircraft, all the stuff you need to fight a full-blown conventional war. Now, about this time, an international airliner flying over the conflict area in eastern Ukraine was shot down by the separatists using a Russian-supplied missile system, anti-aircraft missile system. The flight was MH17, almost 300 people died, mostly Dutch citizens. So there was widespread international uproar over this incident as well. So if we look back at Ukraine by the end of 2014, which was a very tumultuous year, you might say, for Ukraine, Crimea basically had been stolen from Ukraine by Russia, and there is a full-blown conflict happening in the eastern part of the country. Now, I mentioned that I worked in Ukraine. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. When the conflict broke out in 2014, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is an intergovernmental organization that's very similar to the United Nations. It's structured like the UN, it's recognized by the UN, but it's a regional organization. The UN is worldwide. OSCE is primarily a European organization that works in struggling post-Soviet countries. They do things like democracy building, human trafficking, arms control, security, training police forces, things like that. When the war broke out in Ukraine, the OSCE was given a huge task of brokering a ceasefire agreement between Russia, Ukraine, and the pro-Russian separatists. And those agreements, they're called the Minsk agreements. There's 2 ceasefire agreements. And the OSCE also sent international monitoring officers into the conflict areas to record whether or not the ceasefire agreements were being adhered to. The OSCE, by the way, it's headquartered in Vienna. When they sent the international monitoring officers at the height of the mission, we had 700 international monitoring officers from more than 45 different nations scattered throughout Ukraine, but mostly in the conflict areas. I was one of the monitoring officers. I was working with colleagues. I'd go on patrol every day. We were unarmed. We were civilians. We did have body armor that we wore. We were traveling around in armored cars because it was a kinetic environment. It was dangerous. There's mortars and artillery and rockets exploding every day. But on any given day, I might go on patrol with 7 or 8 people. My colleagues might be from Poland, Kyrgyzstan, Sweden, Italy, Russia, different Balkan countries, different Baltic countries. It was a very diverse group of people. Our job in the conflict areas, we were there to document whether or not there are ceasefire violations. We also were reporting on the geopolitical, the socioeconomic, security and human rights conditions. And we'd publish daily reports that were made available to the public. And those were often picked up by the media. We essentially were the eyes and ears of the international community reporting on what was really happening in Ukraine. Because you couldn't really trust the Russian media. You couldn't really trust the Ukrainian media. In theory, we were the neutral truth tellers there, the watchdogs. This is me on a patrol at the Donetsk airport. This airport had just been renovated to the tune of $800 million. It was similar to the Portland airport, brand new airport, and literally within months, it was destroyed. And we're walking through the airport here. This is me on another patrol with the Dutch investigative team going to the crash site of MH17, the airliner that had been shot down. The airliner was shot down at high altitude and it left a debris pattern that covered miles. And on this particular patrol, we had to walk through this forest. And we're picking up articles of clothing and a suitcase and a wallet that was stuck in a tree, things that had belonged to the passengers on that aircraft. So I could go into great detail about all the experiences I had working in Ukraine for 3 years. Mostly when I went on patrol, I'd be interacting with local people, just ordinary people. I'd be going to their homes and maybe their neighbor had been shelled or they had a loved one who was injured or killed. So there's many things that I could tell you from those experiences, but I'll just try to distill it down to this. The thing that I heard the most from Ukrainians was shock and disbelief that a war had broken out in their country. Of course, Ukraine's a big place. There's always going to be differences based on where you live in the country and the ethnicity that you are, slight differences in the religion, some differences in language, stuff like that. But for the most part, everyone in Ukraine prior to the war, they got along okay. The war, which was really artificially created by Russia, it created division and animosity among people and hatred. People who didn't really hate each other prior to the war now hated each other. I want to share one thing real fast. Passing out pieces of shrapnel. I encourage you to take a look at these. Just be careful. These are
Repeat that right by the mic, man. Can you repeat what you just said right by the mic?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I just passed out a piece of shrapnel. These are artillery shrapnel. And one of the most memorable patrols that I had was when I met this woman, this elderly woman. She was a retired music professor, and she was in her 80s, if I remember correctly. She was too poor to move out of the conflict area. And just by a stroke of luck or bad luck, her apartment building, this old Soviet-style apartment building, high-rise, was right in between where the separatists and the Ukrainian government-controlled forces were fighting. So her apartment building had been shelled about a dozen times. And I'll never forget her telling me how she survived when the shelling would happen. She pulled open a drawer and she pulled out pieces of shrapnel, just like the ones I passed out. These had come through her window and had hit her building. She would, when the shelling was happening, she would sit at the piano and play the piano to drown out the war around her. It was heartbreaking to see how the conflict affected people across Ukraine, just normal people. It would be as if Springfield went to war with Eugene, and suddenly we all found ourselves in a place that every day there's mortars exploding and a certain level of uncertainty and anxiety. So last year, Russia decided to proceed with a full-blown invasion of Ukraine in February. It's been just over a year. And I'll just go over key bullet points about what's happened since then. In general, the Russian military has performed poorly compared to what most analysts thought, how analysts thought they would perform. Russia has taken huge losses of personnel and military equipment. 200,000 plus Russian troops have been killed and wounded in the conflict. To put this in perspective, in the 1980s, Russia invaded Afghanistan. And they were there for 10 years. And they withdrew, defeated, and humiliated. Afghanistan to the Russians was kind of like Vietnam was to the United States. During that conflict, Russia lost 15,000 troops. This conflict, 200,000 plus troops killed and wounded. Also, Russia has lost thousands of tanks, vehicles, aircraft, ships. Russia, in the very beginning of the war, they swept in and they took control of large swaths of land in Ukraine, but they have since lost much of that territory. On the other hand, Ukraine is doing much better than expected, and they've made some significant gains, retaking much of the territory that Russia initially captured. Although they've had terrible losses as well. Recently, there was classified documents that were leaked Many of you, I'm sure, have heard about that. And it revealed Western estimates, 150,000 troops, Ukrainian troops have been killed or wounded. That's very significant to Ukraine because Ukraine is a much smaller country than Russia and they have fewer soldiers. Currently, the conflict is kind of at a stalemate. It's a frozen conflict. This is a map that shows you the blue and the pink shows you land that Russia initially took control of. The blue is what Ukraine has taken back. The pink is what Russia currently controls. So why did Russia invade Ukraine? Putin will claim that it was to stop Nazis and the persecution of ethnic Russians and to stop the threat of NATO encroachment. And I'll just briefly touch on these. I think these are bogus excuses. It is true, there are some Nazis, fascists, right-wing extremists in Ukraine, but it's a very small percentage of the population. No bigger than the same kinds of groups within the United States or Russia. Russia has just latched onto those people and blown it out of proportion and turned it into propaganda to justify the war. In the 3 years that I was in Ukraine, traveling to both sides of the conflict on a daily basis, I never saw any of these right-wing extremists in Ukraine. The claim that NATO was encroaching on Russia, I think that's also a bunch of baloney, to be frank. NATO is a defensive organization. They've never threatened to invade Russia, but you can't say the same about Russia threatening their neighbors. Russia invaded Georgia in 2008. They destabilized Moldova, a little place called Transnistria, many years ago. And now they've tried to take over Ukraine. The reality is, by invading Ukraine, it's a huge land and resource grab. Ukraine is a very wealthy country in terms of agricultural land and resources, especially in the east and in Crimea and off the coast of Crimea. There are abundant natural resources that have been untapped. It's estimated $12.4 trillion worth of untapped resources are now under the control of Russia. I also think that Putin sought to prevent Ukraine from competing with the monopoly that they had on supplying energy to Europe. Now, this has all backfired tremendously because prior to the war starting, Russia supplied the majority of gas and oil to all of Europe. Europe, in very short order, has weaned themselves basically of gas and oil from Russia. But Russia is now pivoting and doing more trade with China, for example. I also think that democracy in Ukraine is a threat to Putin. He doesn't want a country to be flourishing with democracy because it might give people ideas in Russia. They might want the same thing. I also think that Putin, he sought to create a legacy for himself. Putin is incredibly bitter about the Soviet Union dissolving in the early 90s. I think he feels like the West betrayed the Soviet Union. And I think Putin definitely has aspirations to build up this empire again and to be a feared country, very powerful country. Here's a map for you quickly. You can see in the east, there's natural gas deposits. The largest gas deposits, though, that have been untapped are off the coast of Crimea, now under Russian control. So why has Russia performed poorly? I apologize. I'm going to plug in my computer before it dies. Give me 1 second. The corruption that exists in Russia it infects everything, and it's infected the military and the military's performance. Russia has always had, also had terrible logistical support with their military. They have a very poorly trained and equipped military. They employ old school Soviet strategies, and there's been a pretty stark inability to learn from their mistakes. The soldiers who are fighting for Russia have poor morale and discipline. They're unprofessional. In some cases, there's been documented cases where units have attacked each other because of various disagreements. And the Wagner group is a group of mercenaries that are fighting on behalf of Russia. And there's even been infighting between the Wagner group and the Russian military itself. Also, as you probably know, the Russian military has been carrying out terrible war crimes, targeting civilians, rape, torture, destroying energy grids. Also within the Russian-controlled areas, there's internal sabotage and partisans who are trying to fight on behalf of Ukraine, who are doing things in a covert manner. There's also diminishing stockpiled high-tech weapons, things like cruise missiles, for example. Why is Ukraine performing better than expected? Well, first of all, they have better morale because they are fighting for their survival. They also, since 2014, have been trained by NATO, so they have more effective strategies. They have been supplied with advanced weapons by the West, things like Javelin anti-tank missiles, drones. And more so than the Russians, they've had the ability to adapt, pivot, innovate. So a few notes on the global effects of the war. One way the war has changed the world is regarding nuclear war, fear of nuclear war. And also fear of nuclear non-proliferation. And when the Soviet Union dissolved in the early 90s, Ukraine had a massive stockpile of nuclear weapons left over from the Soviet Union. In 1994, they signed an agreement with the United Kingdom, with the United States, and with Russia. It's called the Budapest Memorandum. In that agreement, Ukraine agreed to relinquish their nuclear weapons if those other countries promised to respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Obviously, Russia has blatantly broken that promise. This motivates small countries to maybe want to develop their nuclear weapons programs because it's the only guarantee that you're not going to be invaded. That's problematic for world stability. The conflict in Ukraine has also affected global food shortages. There's been a shuffling and a realignment of allies with China, India, and Iran, and African countries cozying up to Russia. It's traditional allies, Central Asian countries and Armenia. It's strained those relationships with Russia. Europe, as I said before, has weaned itself of Russian energy exports. And the conflict has reignited a Cold War. It's escalated tensions and it's bolstered NATO. Talking about the future, it's very difficult to predict because there's so many variables at play. Many different things could happen, but this is just my opinion. It's possible that this conflict could just last a long time. It could be a war of attrition, a stalemate, a frozen conflict. It is possible that Ukraine maybe reclaims more territory, maybe reclaims all its territory. It's possible too that Ukraine is defeated and loses more territory. One issue is there may be waning support for Ukraine in the United States And I'm not picking on any political parties here or anything like that. I'm just objectively explaining what's happening. In general, on the right, there's been some growing political opposition to supporting Ukraine. Also in Europe, Europe is stressed right now with inflation, high energy costs, whether or not there might be some fatigue and some wavering support remains to be seen. In Russia, there's been a real clampdown by the government to prevent dissent. But who knows if that can last? Could there possibly be a coup or a revolution in Russia? Could Putin be taken out of power? And if so, would there be a war crimes tribunal for the Russian government or officials? Possibly, could there be NATO involvement? Maybe there's an incident with, there was an incident with Russian fighter jets intercepting a American drone. You know, could something like that draw NATO into the conflict, potentially sparking a world war? Also, does the conflict in Ukraine, does it embolden a place like China to potentially use military force against Taiwan? There's similarities you can draw between how the Chinese perceive Taiwan and how Russia perceives Ukraine. And the biggest fear that many people have is, could this somehow spark a nuclear confrontation? So that's it for my presentation. I'm going to hand it over to Alina to talk about her personal experiences. And then after that, like I said, we'll open it up to questions and answers. And one thing I'd love to talk about too is, if you'd like to hear, is how people might support and help Ukraine. Alina?
Oh, hello, everybody. Thank you for coming and for your interest in this conflict. And just want to tell you that this presentation made me really emotional, and especially when Cliff showed up those shells from a bomb. It really triggers me. So sorry for me being emotional. I'm a refugee here for already 9 months, and this is crazy, actually. Yeah, sometimes it feels like I've been here forever. It feels so good. New society, super nice people around. I can see Ukrainian flags stick everywhere besides with American flags, and it feels really supportive that I know that people care, and receive really nice and good words of support, and I know that people care. And it still feels like strange be here. It feels like I just came yesterday, and I was afraid that my English is not that consistent, not good. I will be getting around here all by myself, and all those fears that wasn't really like truth though, because I received here lots of help. And first of all, thank to Cliff. He offered me his house to live. Lots of support, his family being really, really supportive, and it was really good and safe transaction, yeah. In the past 9 months, I built a new habit for me, checking on my mom, how she's there back in Ukraine, in east of Ukraine, in the Donbass, in Donetsk, where all this conflict began. And my mom doesn't want to leave because she believes in propaganda, and this is her choice after all. My sister, my brother, oldest brother, we all motivating her to leave, at least to Russia, her beloved Russia, that actually made all this conflict, but she still doesn't want to leave, and this is her choice after all. And nevertheless, I'm checking on her every morning. I wake up, I check on her, I check news. And just 2 days ago, I received a message from her that our house was bombed again. And the grocery store she meant just to go to get some groceries was bombed again, and 7 people died in a bus because bomb got into the bus and people just died alive. They just burned down, and this is terrible, actually. And it's a miracle that she was safe again. And it's not for the first time she meant to go to get groceries, to get food, something like supplements, and won't get into this. And it's just miraculous. And I'm praying every day for her health, for her safety, and I'm deeply grateful that it just, it's really hard to describe, but this is terrible. War is terrifying. It's always bringing terror, fear, death, and it's the worst that can happen to you. Because you can fight cancer, you can fight like murder, like someone, bad guy down the street chasing you, but you cannot fight war, because when bombs shelling and falling over your house, you just cannot do nothing, just but hide and just pray for your safety. Yeah. To be here, I really, really grateful. I learned how to be grateful, and it really feels good to be safe here. I found here shelter. I found here really good new friends. I found here a job, and it feels really good here to start a new life, a new safe society. And Oregonians are really nice people, like super nice. I was so much surprised. I was saying like, stop being so nice. Like it's not even like, how come you're so like smiling, nice, supportive? Sometimes it's really shocking me, like, oh wow, this is like really controversial to the society I've been to. And still, yeah, I feel like if I go back, I will be needing this warmth and support and just unconditional love. Sometimes it's really precious for me, and thanks for that. I think it's really helped me to recover from my traumas from a war, because I had nightmares. I keep on having nightmares. I had a panic attacks because any sound I hear, like little explosion or a car coming past really loudly, it really triggers me. I feel like I want to hide. It's like it's natural body reaction, but I cannot help it. But I know that I'm safe here. Nothing can bad happen, but still it's still with me. Like on the front of my mind, I think like I'm safe here. I got into my work routine. I'm seeing friends. I became like myself here. I shouldn't afraid anymore. I even can make my life plans for at least for tomorrow, because when you in a war, you have to think how you should protect yourself, and you don't think about tomorrow, just think about here and now, and how when it's all going to over, and just as you think about your safety, not just like tomorrow I'll go to seaside and I have to go to groceries and all this domestic and all these chores. You just think how to stay safe and stay alive, because I didn't want to die in this stupid war. It was the worst. And I think after all the experiences, of course, it made me stronger. What doesn't kill you makes you weirder. Yeah, I'm a bit still crazy. I can react differently. Yeah, I can be fearless or something like. But yeah, I try to find benefits from what I experience. Yeah, there is a lot of them that I became stronger. I learned how to be grateful, deeply, deeply grateful. I built even more stronger relationships with the God, and I'm praying for him every day for my safety, that I'm being here, and for safety of my family. And I believe that this awful war will end someday. I know this day is coming, and I'll be able to go home without fearing to die. And I'll see again my family, whom I haven't seen already for about 5 years. Overall, like for all my family members, sorry, my brother who left to live he lived in Kiev, and he had to go to Europe to save his family. And I haven't seen my brother for about already 5 years because of the war. And I think it's a minimal price my family had to pay. We just separated, we don't see each other, but still we are safe, we're alive, and I'm hopeful that I'll see someday them all, and we will get together, have home and kitchen, we'll have a good dinner, and just will be recalling that it's all just a nightmare, and it will never happen again. Thank you.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, sure.
Oh, yeah, it was me probably. Yeah.
Oops, there we go. What's that, Dan? Oh, I see. Stop share. Okay, there we go. So,
Like groups or gatherings of other refugees here locally, where we get together and be able to talk and share about your experiences. Yeah, there are. Yeah.
stand up.
Yeah, sorry, so yeah, there's a lot of refugees, Ukrainian refugees, so not just only refugees, just Ukrainians who moved here a long time ago. Yeah, sometimes we get together and talk and speak, and I have opportunity to speak my home, my mother tongue Russian, because for the 9 months, yeah, I usually speak English, and it's good. Yeah, I improve my English, but still sometimes I just tired speaking English, and yeah, it's good to talk to someone with my mother tongue. Yeah. But I like the fact that I built really good relationships with Americans or even Latin Americans. I don't know, just feels good still. But yeah, there is a lot of Ukrainians with whom I can talk to.
Come over here, how did you do that in terms of visas, getting out of the country?
It was one hell of adventure. It was really challenging because when war happened and Russia attacked Kiev, I was living in Russia at the time. Yeah, it's a year ago. Yeah, two years ago. Yeah, and Cliff reached out to me and he offered me to come here to America to endorse my safety and to begin new life. And that offer was shocking. Like, how come would I come to America? It's different country. It's behind Atlantic Ocean. It's so far away. How come I will go there alone? And initial plan, I would come through Mexico to go to the Mexican border and to ask for parole and to get to America. And while we were waiting until I decided to go, I made a plan, yes, to go to America. The border was shut. So it is illegal now to cross borders from Mexico to America. And US government made a program, Uniting for Ukraine, that helped Ukrainian refugees to come to America straight, to not waiting on a border. And it's safe, it's legal, and it's really good program. So Cliff filled documents as if he's been my sponsor here. And yeah, that's how I came here. I have refugee visa for 2 years. Yeah, that's how I came here.
I'll piggyback on that too. And to say that the program that Irina talked about, United for Ukraine, it's a US government program that fast tracks Ukrainian immigration here for refugees. And if you're interested in knowing how you might help, there are Ukrainians who sometimes are looking for what's called a sponsor to come to the United States. The important thing to know, I'm a sponsor for Alina, is when you become a sponsor, it's kind of a good faith agreement. You're telling the government that, like, I'm going to be attached to this person and help take care of them and do some of the legwork necessary to get them here and give them a shelter, for example. But you're not on the hook for anything. There's no legal obligation financially or legally to do anything. It's just the US government didn't want Ukrainian refugees to come here, and then next thing you know, they're homeless on the streets and something like that. So it's a good faith agreement. There are some Ukrainians who need to come here and they need a lot of support. Maybe they can't afford an airline ticket, for example. And when they first come here, they need not only a place to live, but food initially, and just have their basic needs taken care of. Whereas there's some other Ukrainians who have some savings and they can pay for their airline ticket and they can pay for their food. They just need a place to live initially, or in some cases, they can afford to rent a place. They just need someone on paper to be their sponsor so they can come here. But if you're interested in the opportunity to sponsor Ukrainian, maybe an individual or a family or a couple, let me know, let Lena know. We'll be glad to walk you through that process and to answer questions about it.
If I can take it back a little bit into your presentation, but I'm really follows this. So some of what I have to say, but in an observation, Ukraine has been part of what people think of as Russia for a very long time. My son points out to me that there was Ukraine, then there was Muscovy, Russia. Obviously. But that goes back to the founding fathers. And in part, what Putin has in fact his mind is not just empire building, but a reestablishment of the time when Russia was great, make Russia great again. And if you look culturally, you also find that Ukraine has produced a sizable number of the intellectuals that most of the world is considered to be Russian. The one that sticks out for me, it's really interested in music, is Modest Mussorgsky, who wrote, started as a piano composition, so I'll take it straight into pictures of an exhibition. I was familiar with it. The last picture in his composition is the Great Gate as Kiev, because that was where it was from. People think of Mussorgsky as a Russian composer. Isn't that Ukrainian? My favorite is that within my lifetime, possibly, and this is very much the best Russian leader was Nikita Khrushchev, who, while he was born in Russia, wasn't that far in terms of where he was born, where he grew up, from Ukraine. So there was a large amount of influence on his upbringing. It's like, and if I'm not mistaken, he made his initial political career as a sort of in Ukraine. So for Putin and for those who support him, you have this idea of reestablishing Russia when it was at its height. As, you know, all of the other things you said are very true, but in people's minds, especially amongst the Russian hierarchy, you're going to have this, you know, we need to get this back. No, we're going to be nothing without it. And then bringing it up to big, and this is my son's view. He is certain that Russia is in for a, if not an assassination of Putin, then certainly a removal followed by assassination. So it's a little cleaner. And that what we see, and I've heard news reports on this, that You mentioned Wagner Group. There are other militia groups that are allying and integrating with the Russian armed forces that have the potential to be factions in a new Russian Revolution. And final thought, if Ukraine does not get everything back, it has no hope for future without war with Russia, because they will always want to get that. So even your scenario of like Vietnam, hang on for 10 years, unless Ukraine comes out on top, or worst case scenario is reinforced. It's going to be a conflict area from here until.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate the comments and the contributions you just made. I think, empires ebb and flow. And if Putin's intention is to recreate the Russian Empire at its height, well, if every empire did that around the world, the United Kingdom, for example, controlled a huge portion of the world at some point. Mongolia controlled a huge portion of the world under Genghis Khan. And the Ottomans controlled much of the world at some point. So we just have to deal with reality as it is. That's just part of the world order, is empires ebb and flow. I think we can all say that China's kind of on the uprise right now, and the United States is kind of struggling. So it's not justification to carry out war against another country. Yes.
I have a question from Phil Bales, who's online. He said, how close are the Russian and Ukrainian languages, and can they understand each other?
Russian and Ukrainian language are pretty close. But as I was born in Ukraine, but still in the part that speaks Russian, and my mother tongue is Russian. And I learned Ukrainian in school. That's why I understand it. But Russians who live in Russia, they don't understand Ukrainian. Maybe they know a couple of words, something basic, but when they hear it, they don't understand. They cannot speak it actually. And that war brought the idea that we're still not the same nation, because Putin's propaganda tried to involve we all same nation, we're all brothers. It's actually not the truth. Mentality is different and language is different. Whereas help since I know Ukrainian, I understand Polish a bit, and some Yugoslavian languages like Croatian or Macedonian. I still a bit understand it. So Ukrainian language is more closer to other Slavic languages than Russian. Russian is a bit still different.
Would you say they're like 80% similar, maybe?
Yeah, about 90% similar, but still, Ukrainian is.
Just one other comment, we had some visitors from Ukraine at our house, and one of their comments was that since the war started, the people that tended to speak more Russian, they tried to speak more Ukrainian. And stop speaking Russian.
Refusing speaking Russian because it's language of terrorists, and the refusing has any mutual with it. Even those who spoke the language goes Surgic, half Russian, half Ukrainian. It's not. It sounds incorrectly. It sounds a bit, like if you mix English and Spanish, will be Spanglish. So some people in Ukraine, in maybe little villages, spoke half and a half, but even them trying to speak more pure Ukrainian than mix it with Russian.
And I think an unfortunate byproduct of this war again is the way it's divided people. Because in the past, all the major cities in Ukraine, most of the major cities spoke Russian predominantly. Odessa, Kharkiv, Dnipro, Donetsk, Kiev. But since the war started, now there's a rejection by Ukrainian society to not want to speak Russian anymore.
Your siblings, brothers or sisters, are they
They all left Ukraine and so are in the US or in other countries?
So my sister now, she's in Russia. She went there, she found their work, and while I wasn't home, she left first from amongst our family, she left first because her boyfriend could be recruited to DPR army as a rebel to fight against Ukraine. It's really dangerous there. And he was hiding for a few months until he got opportunity to go to Russia and simply run away and save himself from a war. Yeah, and that's why my sister's there in Russia and she's safe. Like life in Russia is not easy, especially now, but yeah, at least she's safe. And my brother now, he's in Europe. And he sent his family back to Kiev again. Yeah,
He's
because
in Germany or Austria?
he's in Germany now. Yeah, and he sent his family, my 5 years old nephew and his wife. He sent them back to Ukraine. They still wanted to go back home, and because little boy, he cannot speak German. He doesn't want to learn it, and he was really happy to go back home and to go to kindergarten, and because he has a lot of friends, and he become more lively and active, and yeah, it's actually the good that they went back home. Yeah.
On the opposite side of that, what's it like to live in Russia? The team, like it was set up to be this is good.
Russia is a different country, and I lived in Moscow, like in the Moscow suburbs. I lived, and I had to go to Moscow to work, and it took me about like 4 hours back and forth to get to work. It's really a big city, and people there are different and indifferent to the conflict, to the war, or someone's really supported it. They were carrying those Z and those stupid symbols of this war, and I feel like I don't want to stay here because people don't care about DPR and LPR, Donetsk People Republic and Luhansk People Republic that Russia took and made us think that it's Russian territory. Russians themselves don't give it up. Actually, they live really miserable lives sometimes, and they don't really care about the war. They just they've been really racist, really rude, and it was really hard to stay there because most of the people, most society really supported war. And when war came out, when Russia bombed Kiev, I feel like I'm in a trap. I cannot go to Ukraine because it's also bombing. My home was taken, and it's also dangerous to go there. And now I'm happen to be in Russia, and I just hate it because I feel like society just doesn't want me. It's not supporting. And I feel like it was really impossible to stay there. Yeah.
And speaking to that, then how would you address that? And of course, only heard it from the news, so who knows where that fits in reality, is that children that are being taken from Ukraine to Russia.
Yeah, that's true. They simply kidnapping kids from Mariupol. It's a city to south of from Donbass, and it has entrance to the seaside. And Russia took this city, and it's just left nothing from it. Just like all buildings destroyed to the ground, and citizens had to bury their family members just in the front yards because they didn't have access to cemetery to have humane funerals. It was just hell on earth. It was so terrible. And I lived in this city for a while, and the house where I lived in, it's destroyed, absolutely destroyed. It's really painful to see how those places that are dear to your heart are just destroyed, and just everywhere Russia comes brings destroy and death and all atrocities. And their kids was really taken to Russia by force because their parents were in a prison or died. And that's why Putin were proclaimed to he'll be in a Gaga court someday because it's out of law, like out international law to kidnap kids.
Yeah, there, maybe you know that there was a, what do you call it? A warrant essentially for
Yeah.
Putin's arrest by the
Yeah.
International
Yeah.
Tribunal because of the child trafficking, taking these kids to Russia. And I mean, the war itself is unjust, but to then take kids, orphan kids, bring them to Russia and indoctrinate them just is evil upon evil, if you ask me. And even within Donbass, you know, I lived in the separatist controlled area. And I met tons of people there. The people weren't bad, they're just normal, nice people. But in some cases, they are indoctrinated, and in other cases, they wanted nothing to do with war. But unfortunately, many of the young men or even older men have been forced into conscription now to go fight. And I'll be honest with you. Yeah, there's been times I've been so upset about the conflict in Ukraine that I've fantasized about just wanting to like snap my fingers and every Russian soldier would die on the spot. But I think, man, a lot of the Russian soldiers are people I know. You know, I used to go to the supermarket and I made friends with these young guys. I think they're 19 years old. And I'd always go visit with them and kind of ham it up. They're just nice guys. They had wanted nothing to do with the conflict or war. But I have no doubt that unless they hid out in their apartment, they're probably forced to go fight on the front line. And many people have termed the conflict as kind of a meat grinder for Russia, because they're just throwing soldiers to the front line, sometimes with a week of training, with rusty old weapons, very much like they did in World War II, when Russia lost millions upon millions of soldiers. It's just, in every sense, it's just tragic, heartbreaking.
Said that you compared the loss of soldiers, Russian soldiers now compared to when they tried to leave Afghanistan. It is most of that because of technology and the difference in the weapons, or is that something else explain that?
It's a good question. I think, well, obviously Putin underestimated what would happen when he invaded Ukraine. Things have not gone according to plan at all. And I think it's, as I pointed out before, it's because Ukrainian troops have been trained by NATO. Ukraine has a ton of sophisticated weapons that have been supplied by the West. And the Russians, it's a combination of Ukrainians performing well and Russians performing so poorly. So it's just resulted in tremendous loss of life.
But if your brother went back to Ukraine, he had to be in the military, or is that?
No, he never been in the military.
If he went back, would he have to be? Could he be?
Yeah, I think, yeah, he'll be forced to be recruited to the military, yeah.
There was something in the news I read years ago about conversation between Steve and Trump.
Mhm.
And Trump was requesting something from me. I don't remember the specific, requesting something, and that's how it all, the timeline of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I can't remember what the specifics were of that. But I remember he was asking something for something that Zelensky didn't do.
Right. So are you talking about the incident where Trump was threatening to withhold support unless they dug up dirt basically on Biden, and which is the reason that Trump was impeached? I don't know if that had anything to do with Putin's decision to invade. And also, I don't want to make this talk political and take one side or another, but just speaking to the facts as they are. I would have to guess that the Russian government maybe has a preference for having Trump be in power, because Trump has kind of shown a tendency to be Russian leaning often.
It's obvious following story.
Yeah.
Was it without military support?
Yes. Yes.
We are at time. I know we can keep probably talking about this for hours. And so thank you both for coming
Thank
and
you.
speaking today.
Thank you.
And next week, our very own Jean France will be speaking on her recent trip to Guatemala. So come back next week for more conversation.
Thanks, Monte.
Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity
Thank you.
to speak. Okay, both of us had our contact info up here. I could talk about the conflict in Ukraine for days. So feel free to reach out if you want to talk more. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle.
I'm gonna stop the recording, so just leave your PC on for just.
Okay. Oh, I'm gonna give you this one. I'm just, I don't know if it's allergies or my lymph nodes.
Thank you so much for coming.
It's the second time. You're the only person to see it twice.
What's that?
You're the only person to see it twice. Well, I guess
Actually
Nancy-
recorded the whole thing. So I recorded it all.
Thank you.